The red dust of the Nevada road had worked its way into every fold of her silk tunic, turning the vibrant blue to a weary brown. Mai clutched the small, cloth-wrapped bundle that held everything she owned in the world and watched the freight wagon disappear, a shrinking speck in the shimmering heat. The driver had taken her last silver coin and pointed down the lane. Miller Farm, he'd grunted. They're the ones got the homestead claim on this stretch. 7 of them. Then he'd flicked the reins and left her standing in a silence so vast it felt like a physical weight. She had been promised to a merchant in the bustling town of Argenta, a man of supposed wealth who had paid a handsome bride price to her family a world away. But when the wagon had arrived, there was no merchant. There was only the driver's impatience and a shrug that sealed her fate. Abandoned. The word was a stone in her throat. For 2 days, she had walked, following the railroad tracks until her feet were raw, until the kind but hurried woman on a buckboard had given her a ride this far, telling her the Miller brothers were decent folk, if a bit rough. Now, looking at the farmhouse at the end of the lane, she wasn't so sure. It was a sprawling, unfinished thing of raw timber, more a collection of connected buildings than a single house. And in the yard, 7 men. They were huge, their shoulders broad from labor, their faces weathered by the sun. They moved with the easy economy of men who worked the earth from dawn until dusk, stacking firewood, mending a harness, their voices carrying on the dry air. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. These were not the people of her village. They were giants in a land that seemed to have no edges. But the sun was beginning to dip below the distant, jagged mountains, and the chill of the high desert night was already creeping into the air. She had no water, no food, and nowhere else to go. Taking a breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, Mai started down the lane. The crunch of her worn slippers on the gravel silenced their talk. One by one, they turned, their expressions ranging from surprise to suspicion. The eldest, a man with streaks of grey in his beard and the clear eyes of a leader, stepped forward. His shadow stretched long and intimidating. "Can we help you, miss?" His voice was deep, not unkind, but heavy with caution. Mai stopped a respectful distance away and bowed her head, her gaze fixed on the ground in front of her. She could not meet his eyes. The English words she had practiced for months felt clumsy and foreign on her tongue. "Please, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I am lost. I ask for nothing. Just a corner. A place in the barn to sleep, away from the night. She did not dare tell them the truth of her situation. To be an abandoned bride was to be disgraced, a piece of unwanted cargo. She was simply lost. It was a smaller, safer lie. A corner was all she could hope for, a shield against the coyotes she'd heard yipping in the hills the night before. The 7 brothers looked at one another. The silence stretched, filled only by the lowing of a cow in a nearby corral and the buzz of insects in the dry grass. She kept her head bowed, her knuckles white where she gripped her bundle. She had made her plea. Now, all she could do was wait for their judgment, for the single word that would mean the difference between a cold, dangerous night under the stars and the simple mercy of a roof. She did not yet know that her simple request would unravel the quiet, ordered world these men had built for themselves, and that the room they would eventually build for her would be founded on something far stronger than timber and nails. The eldest brother, Caleb, stroked his beard, his gaze sweeping over the small, dusty figure before them. She looked impossibly fragile against the vast, unforgiving landscape. He could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the fine tremor in her hands. He exchanged a look with Benjamin, his second, who stood slightly apart from the others. Benjamin's face was unreadable as always, but his eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing. It was Aaron, the most talkative of the bunch, who broke the silence. "A corner in the barn? Caleb, we can't just. She's a woman, alone." He sounded flustered, glancing at his other brothers, Levi and Daniel, who looked equally uncertain. Samuel, the gentlest of them, who had a way with spooked animals, looked pained by her plight. The youngest, Josiah, simply stared, his mouth slightly agape. Caleb held up a hand. "She's asked for shelter for the night." That's all. He turned his attention back to Mai, who had not moved, her head still bowed in a gesture of complete submission. It was that stillness, that lack of demand, that pricked at his conscience. This wasn't some grifter looking for a handout. This was desperation. The barn is warm enough. We'll give her some blankets and a meal. What if someone comes looking for her? Daniel, the practical one, asked, his brow furrowed. We don't know who she is or where she's from. Bringing a stranger onto the claim, it could mean trouble. And leaving her out on the road for the coyotes means what, Daniel? Benjamin's voice was low, but it cut through the other's anxieties. It means we're not the men our father raised. That settled it. No one argued with Benjamin when he spoke in that tone. Caleb nodded, his decision made. Samuel, fetch some blankets from the house. Levi, there's leftover stew from dinner. Heat it up. Aaron, get a lantern for the barn. He addressed me directly, his voice softer now. Miss, you can have the barn for tonight. It's dry and safe. We'll bring you something to eat. Mai finally lifted her head, her dark eyes wide with a relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. She bowed again, deeper this time. Thank you, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Thank you. Samuel returned with a stack of thick wool blankets, his movements gentle as he handed them to her. He offered a small, shy smile that she returned with a hesitant one of her own. Levi, a man built like an oak tree, emerged from the house with a steaming bowl of beef stew and a chunk of bread. He thrust it towards her gruffly, avoiding her eyes, but his gesture was one of pure kindness. They led her to the large barn, the air inside thick with the sweet smell of hay and warm animals. Aaron hung a lit lantern from a beam, casting a golden, dancing light over the space. He pointed to a clean, empty stall filled with fresh straw. This'll do, he said cheerfully. Safer in here than out there. Mai placed her bundle down and accepted the food, sitting on a low stool and eating with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed out of place in the rustic barn. The brothers lingered for a moment, an awkward semicircle of large men watching a small woman eat. It was a strange picture, one that none of them could have imagined that morning. They were a self-contained unit, 7 men who had carved a life out of the harsh Nevada soil through sheer force of will and brotherhood. They didn't have visitors, especially not ones like this. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. We'll be in the house. The dog, Shep, he'll bark if anyone comes up the lane. You're safe here. We'll see to you in the morning. Mai nodded, her bowl empty. You are good men, she said softly. The simple sincerity of her words hung in the air after they left, pulling the heavy barn door closed behind them. Alone in the lantern light, surrounded by the soft sounds of sleeping animals, Mai wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. It was more kindness than she had received in weeks. For the first time since stepping off the boat in California, a sliver of hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, began to flutter in her chest. She had asked for a corner, and they had given her a sanctuary. Mai was awake long before the first hint of grey lightened the eastern sky. Sleep had been fitful, her mind a whirlwind of fear and gratitude. She folded the wool blankets with precise, neat corners, just as she had been taught, and left them stacked in the stall. Her duty was clear. She could not accept their charity without offering something in return. To do so would be to lose the last shred of her dignity. Her purpose was to work, to serve. It was the only value she had left. She slipped out of the barn and crept towards the main house. A single lamp burned in a window, a warm yellow eye in the pre-dawn gloom. The door was unlocked. She eased it open and stepped inside, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the wooden floorboards. The main room was a testament to the lives of 7 bachelors. Boots were kicked off by the hearth, plates from the night before sat on a side table, and a fine layer of dust coated every surface that wasn't in daily use. The air was stale with the scent of old wood smoke and leather. It was the kitchen, though, that truly captured her attention. It was a large, functional space, but chaotic. A mountain of dirty dishes filled a wash basin, coffee grounds were spilled on the counter, and sacks of flour and sugar leaned against a wall, one of them leaking a small white drift onto the floor. This, she understood. This was a language of work she could speak fluently. Quietly, she set about her task. She found the well pump just outside the back door and carried bucket after bucket of cold, clean water to heat on the massive cast iron stove. As the water warmed, she began to clean. She swept the floor, wiped down the long trestle table, and washed every last pot, pan, and dish, drying them and stacking them neatly on the open shelves. She worked with a silent, focused efficiency, her small frame a blur of motion in the growing light. She found their stores of food, potatoes, onions, smoked bacon, and eggs from a coop she'd spotted near the barn. From these simple ingredients, she began to prepare a meal. It was Benjamin who found her first. He always rose before the others, a habit of quiet solitude he cherished. He walked into the kitchen expecting the usual mess and stopped dead in the doorway. The room was transformed. It was clean, orderly, and filled with the savory aroma of frying bacon and onions. And at the stove stood the woman from the barn, a borrowed apron tied around her waist, her expression one of intense concentration as she stirred something in a skillet. She looked up, startled by his presence, her eyes wide with apprehension. She immediately bowed her head. "I am sorry if I presume," she said, her voice soft. "I wish to thank you for your kindness." Benjamin was speechless for a moment. He simply stared at the clean counters, the tidy shelves, the promise of a hot breakfast he hadn't had to cook himself in years. He wasn't a man of many words. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement. "Smells good," he managed to say, his voice gruff. One by one, the other brothers were drawn by the smell. They crowded into the kitchen, their reactions a mirror of Benjamin's. Shock, followed by a slow, dawning appreciation. Aaron let out a low whistle. Levi sniffed the air like a contented bear. Caleb looked from the spotless room to the small woman by the stove, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "It is my place," Mai replied simply, not as a servant, but as someone stating a fact of their own being. She began to portion out the food onto the clean plates, mounds of scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, and fried potatoes. She set them on the table, along with a pot of fresh, strong coffee. The brothers sat down, a bit stunned, and began to eat. The food was simple, but it was delicious, seasoned with a skill none of them possessed. For the first time in a long time, the house felt less like a barracks and more like a home. They ate in a companionable silence, the only sounds the clinking of forks against plates. Mai did not eat with them. She stood by the stove, waiting, her hands clasped behind her back. She had created order from their chaos, and in doing so, had carved out a small space for herself, a purpose beyond just surviving the night. The question of what would happen next hung in the air, unspoken but felt by every man at the table. A week turned into 2, and an unspoken arrangement settled over the Miller farm. Mai never asked to stay, and the brothers never asked her to leave. She had moved from the barn into a small storage room off the kitchen, which she kept as neat as a pin. Every morning, she rose before them, and every evening, a hot, well-cooked meal was waiting on the table when they came in from the fields. The house had never been so clean, their clothes never so well-mended. She moved through their lives with a quiet grace that they quickly came to depend on, a silent, steadying presence in their boisterous, masculine world. She asked for nothing, but her industry was a constant gift. The delicate balance was disturbed, as it always is, by the outside world. Caleb and Aaron drove the buckboard into Argenta for supplies, a monthly ritual of stocking up on salt, sugar, tools, and news. As they loaded sacks of flour onto the wagon, the town's most prosperous landowner, a man named Fletcher Sterling, approached them. Sterling was a man who had gotten rich not by working the land, but by owning it, holding deeds and leveraging debts. He was always dressed in a fine suit, even in the dust of a Nevada town, and his smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Miller," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Heard you've taken on some new help out at your place." Caleb stiffened. He'd known this was coming. News traveled fast in a place like Argenta. "We're managing," he said, his tone noncommittal as he heaved another sack. Sterling chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Don't be modest. the whole town's talking. 7 lonely brothers and a little China doll, all alone out on the prairie. It's a story worthy of a dime novel. Aaron, whose temper was quicker than Caleb's, stepped forward. You watch your mouth, Sterling. She's a guest under our roof, and we'll thank you to speak of her with respect. Sterling's smile widened, showing his teeth. Respect? For unclaimed property? I happen to know a bit about her situation. I do business with a number of merchants, you see. Including those who import exotic goods. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The man who paid her passage, a Mr. Fang, is a business associate of mine. A very serious man. He was unavoidably delayed, I hear. I imagine he'll be quite interested to learn where his investment has ended up. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Sterling was implying that Mai was not a guest, but a commodity, and that they were interfering with another man's property. Caleb felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his stomach. He set his jaw, his eyes locking with Sterling's. He knew men like Sterling. They thrived on leverage, on knowing things others didn't, on holding power over people. She is a lady who found herself in unfortunate circumstances, Caleb said, his voice low and steady, each word chosen with deliberate weight. And she is under the protection of my family. If this Mr. Fang has business with her, he can conduct it at our farm, in a civilized manner. But until then, I'd advise you to keep your dime novel stories to yourself. He turned his back on Sterling, a clear dismissal, and motioned for Aaron to finish loading the wagon. They worked in silence, the tension thick between them. Sterling watched them for a long moment before turning and walking away, a satisfied smirk on his face. He had planted his seed of trouble and now he would wait to see what grew. On the ride back to the farm, Caleb was quiet, the buggy wheels crunching on the gravel road. The peace they had found was fragile, he realized. A storm was coming, and the small woman who had brought so much warmth into their home was standing right in the center of it. He now knew a name he wished he didn't, Fang. And he had a feeling they would be meeting this man soon enough. That evening, the mood at the dinner table was somber. Caleb had relayed his conversation with Sterling, and the information settled heavily in the room. The name Fang was an unwelcome ghost at their feast. Mai, sensitive to the shift in atmosphere, served the meal quietly, her eyes darting between the brothers' troubled faces. She knew this was about her. The peace had been too good to last. After the meal, as she was clearing the plates, Benjamin followed her out to the small porch where she often sat to watch the last of the light fade from the sky. He leaned against a post, not speaking for a long moment, just watching the horizon burn orange and purple. He was the brother she understood the most, perhaps because he spoke the least. His actions were his language. He was the one who had quietly fixed the loose step on the porch she used, the one who left a bucket of the first ripe tomatoes from his garden by the kitchen door for her. "You're safe here," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. Mai looked at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "For now," she whispered. "But this man, this Mr. Fang, he paid for me. In my country, that is a debt that must be honored." "This isn't your country," Benjamin replied, his gaze still on the mountains. "Laws are different here. People are supposed to be different." He didn't sound entirely convinced himself. A silence fell between them, comfortable and deep. Emboldened by his quiet strength, Mai found herself wanting to tell him the truth, to unburden herself of the secret she had carried. She reached into the collar of her tunic and pulled out a thin, silken cord. On it hung a small, smooth piece of jade, carved in the shape of a simple fish. It was pale green, worn smooth from years of handling. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It is all I have left of my home. She gave it to me before I left." For luck, she let out a small, bitter laugh. "It has not been very lucky," she told him then, about the arrangement, about the promises made by the matchmaker of a kind, wealthy merchant who would give her a good life in America. She showed him the letter she carried, a folded piece of rice paper covered in elegant characters. "It is from him. Mr. Fang." It was sent with the final payment to my family, she explained. It speaks of a new life. Of a home he was preparing for me in Argenta. Benjamin took the letter she offered. He couldn't read the characters, of course, but he could see the quality of the paper, the confident strokes of the ink. He could also see the way her hands trembled as she held it out to him. He gently folded it and handed it back. A man's promises are only as good as his actions, he said. He promised you a home and left you on the side of a road. Sterling said he was delayed, Mai offered, though she didn't believe it. A man like that doesn't get delayed without sending word, Benjamin countered. He didn't expect you to find your way here. He didn't expect you to find people who would stand for you. He turned to look at her then, his expression serious in the fading light. We'll stand for you, Mai. All of us. Her breath hitched. It was the first time any of them had used her name. To them, she had been the woman, miss, a guest. But he had said her name, Mai. It meant beautiful in her language, a name she had always felt she didn't deserve. But hearing it from him, spoken so plainly and with such conviction, it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like she belonged. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She wasn't just a piece of unclaimed property. She was Mai. And for the first time, she felt she had allies, a family, in this vast and lonely land. The hope that had been a fragile flutter was now becoming a small, steady flame. 3 days later, a dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of a visitor. It was not a familiar buckboard or a farmer's wagon. This was a smart, black buggy, pulled by a handsome black horse that moved with an expensive, high-stepping gait. The brothers were in the fields, but they saw it coming. Caleb sent Josiah running back to the house to stand with Mai while the rest of them followed, their pace deliberate, their hands clean of tools. The buggy pulled up in the yard, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit, a stark contrast to the rustic setting. His face was angular and intelligent, and his movements were precise. He was not a man accustomed to physical labor. He surveyed the farm with a look of faint disdain before his eyes landed on Mai, who stood on the porch, with Josiah a step behind her like a nervous guard dog. By the time Caleb and the other 5 brothers arrived, forming a solid wall between the buggy and the house, the man was already walking towards the porch. He stopped and gave a slight, formal bow. I am looking for the Miller brothers, he said. His English was perfect, accented but clear. You found them, Caleb said, his stance wide, his arms crossed over his chest. He made no move to offer a handshake. The man's gaze flickered over the 6 formidable figures before him, then settled back on Mai. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed his features before being replaced by a smooth, polite mask. My name is Fang, he announced. And I have come to collect my betrothed. The name landed in the yard like a stone. Mai flinched as if struck, and Josiah took a half-step closer to her. The air grew thick with tension. There seems to be some misunderstanding, Fang continued, his tone reasonable, as if explaining a simple business transaction. I was unfortunately detained on business in San Francisco. A matter of a late shipment that required my personal attention. I had arranged for the young lady to be cared for in Argenta until my arrival, but it seems the wagon driver made an error. A regrettable inconvenience, for which I apologize. His story was smooth, plausible, but his eyes were cold. They held no apology, only a possessive glint as they rested on Mai. She's had more than an inconvenience, Mr. Fang, Caleb said, his voice a low growl. She was left on the road with nothing. We took her in. For which I am grateful, Fang said with another slight bow, a gesture that seemed mocking in its formality. You have sheltered my property, and I am prepared to compensate you for your trouble. A token of my appreciation for your rustic hospitality, he reached into his coat pocket. She's not property, Benjamin said, his voice quiet but carrying a dangerous edge. And we don't want your money. Fang's polite facade finally cracked. A flash of anger tightened his jaw. He had expected simple farmers, easily intimidated or bought. He had not expected this united front of stubborn, protective men. He straightened up, his demeanor shifting from courteous merchant to a man accustomed to getting his way. "She is my bride, paid for in full," he stated, his voice now hard as iron. "I have a contract, a legal document recognized by the territorial authorities. She belongs to me. This is a matter of law, not sentiment." He turned his cold gaze fully on my. "Pack your things. We are leaving." My stood frozen on the porch, trapped between the 7 men who had shown her kindness and the 1 man who owned her future. The life she had been promised had arrived, and it looked nothing like the dream she had been sold. It looked like a cage. Mr. Fang, seeing the defiance in the brothers' stances, produced a folded document from his inner coat pocket. It was an official-looking paper with a wax seal. "This," he said, holding it up for them to see, "is the bride price agreement, countersigned by a clerk in San Francisco. It details the payment made to her family and her contractual obligation to me. It is legally binding. If you persist in obstructing me, you will be guilty of theft. I assure you, the territorial marshal will take a dim view of homesteaders who steal another man's rightful property." Daniel, who understood contracts and figures better than the others, stepped forward to examine the document, though he could not read the characters of Mai's name. He could, however, recognize the official stamps and the confident signature at the bottom. "It looks legal," he murmured to Caleb, a worried frown creasing his brow. The threat of the law was a potent one. Their homestead claim was their entire world, the product of years of back-breaking labor. A legal challenge from a wealthy merchant could tie them up in court for years, bleed them dry of every cent they had, and potentially cost them the very land they stood on. Fear, a more insidious enemy than any man, began to creep into the yard. "She does not wish to go with you," Caleb stated, his voice firm, though he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Fang let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Her wishes are irrelevant. The arrangement was made. The debt is settled. She is mine." He took a step toward the porch, his patience clearly exhausted. "My. Do not make this more difficult. You will dishonor your family if you defy me." The mention of her family was a deliberate, cruel blow. Mai visibly shrank, the weight of filial duty a heavy burden. In her culture, to defy such an agreement was to bring shame upon her ancestors. She looked at the brothers, her eyes filled with a desperate plea, then at the hard, unyielding face of the man who claimed her. Levi moved to block Fang's path, his huge frame an immovable obstacle. "You're not taking her," he said, his voice a low rumble. Fang stopped, his eyes narrowing into slits. His polite mask was gone completely, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. "You are making a grave mistake, farmer," he hissed. "I am a patient man, but my patience has its limits. I will return. And when I do, I will have the law with me. You will hand her over, or you will lose everything. This farm, this land, it will all be forfeit. I will see you ruined." With that, he turned on his heel, strode back to his buggy, and climbed in. He didn't look back as he snapped the reins, the fine horse turning and carrying him away in another cloud of dust, leaving his threats to hang in the oppressive summer heat. The brothers stood in silence for a long time after he was gone, the legal document and the ruin it promised seeming to poison the very air they breathed. Mai remained on the porch, tears streaming down her face. The sanctuary they had offered her had now become a battleground, and she was the cause. The choice before the Miller brothers was now stark and terrible: save themselves, or save her. They could not do both. That night, the house was suffocatingly quiet. No one ate the dinner Mai had prepared. The brothers gathered in the main room, speaking in low, troubled tones. Mai could hear the murmur of their voices through the thin wooden walls of her small room. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the conflict, the weight of the decision they faced. Daniel's voice was tense, likely explaining the legal ramifications, the very real possibility of losing their homestead. Aaron's was agitated, rising and falling with frustration. Even Caleb's steady baritone sounded strained. She knew what she had to do. They had shown her a kindness she would never forget, but she could not be the reason for their ruin. It was a debt she could never repay. Her own fate was sealed, but she would not drag them down with her. With trembling hands, she packed her few belongings back into the cloth bundle. Her mother's jade pendant felt cool against her skin. She took one of the wool blankets they had given her that first night and folded it neatly, leaving it on the small cot. Then, she wrote a note. Her English was not good for writing, so she drew. She drew 7 tall stalks of wheat, standing strong together. Then she drew a single, smaller flower, separate from them, with an arrow pointing away, toward the mountains. It was the best she could do. A picture of her gratitude, and her departure. Clutching her bundle, she slipped out the back door, moving like a ghost through the yard she had come to know so well. The moon was high, casting long shadows that seemed to claw at her. She would walk to Argenta. She would find Mr. Fang. She would accept her fate. She had just reached the edge of the yard, where the lane met the main road, when a figure stepped out from the shadow of the barn, blocking her path. It was Benjamin. He wasn't holding a lantern, but she could see his silhouette clearly against the starry sky. "Leaving won't solve anything," he said, his voice soft in the night air. Mai stopped, her heart pounding. "I cannot let you lose your home because of me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It is not right. And it's not right for a man to treat a person like a piece of property he owns," Benjamin countered, taking a step closer. "We had a vote." She looked at him, confused. It wasn't a long discussion, he continued. Daniel laid out the risks. "They're real. We could lose it all." Then Caleb asked for a show of hands. All those in favor of telling Mr. Fang to go to hell. He paused. It was unanimous. Mai stared at him, unable to process his words. They had chosen her. They had looked at the ruin of their lives on one hand, and her, a stranger they had known for only a few weeks, on the other. And they had chosen her. "Why?" she asked, the word a breath of disbelief. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. "This is our home. We decide who stays here." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the bundle from her hand. "Come on back to the house, Mai. You're not going anywhere." He turned and started walking back, not waiting to see if she would follow, confident that she would. And she did. As she walked beside him, back toward the warm light of the farmhouse, she felt a profound shift inside her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. For the first time, she was not just a victim of her circumstances. She was part of something. She was one of them. The brothers had made their choice, and now she had made hers. She would not run. She would stand with them, whatever the cost. 2 days passed in a state of tense vigilance. The brothers worked their fields with one eye always on the road. They took turns staying near the house, ensuring Mai was never alone. The threat of Fang's return loomed over them, a constant, oppressive weight. They expected him to come with the marshal, brandishing his legal papers and the power of the territory. What came instead was far more direct. Near sundown on the second day, 3 riders appeared, not in a buggy, but on horseback. Fang was in the lead, his fine suit replaced by more practical riding clothes. The 2 men with him were not lawmen. They were hard-faced, rough-looking men, the kind who hired their guns out to the highest bidder. They stopped just short of the miller's property line, a clear attempt at intimidation. The 7 brothers emerged from the house and the barn, gathering in the yard. They carried no weapons, only the grim determination etched on their faces. They were farmers, not fighters, but they were 7 strong, and this was their land. "I told you I would return," Fang called out, his voice carrying across the dusty yard. "I am giving you one last chance. Send out the woman, and I will be on my way. Refuse, and these gentlemen and I will be forced to retrieve my property ourselves." Caleb stepped forward, his brothers fanning out behind him in a solid line. "She is not your property, and you are not welcome here, Fang. Turn around and leave." Fang sneered. "So be it." He dismounted, as did his men, and started walking toward them. Just then, Mai appeared on the porch. The brothers turned, alarmed, but she held up a hand, her expression calm and resolute. She was no longer the frightened, submissive woman who had arrived weeks ago. She had made a choice to stand, and she would not hide now. She walked down the steps and stood beside Caleb, facing the man who claimed to own her. Her eyes, however, were not on Fang. They were on his horse. It was a fine animal, but it was lathered in sweat, its sides heaving. The horses of his hired men were similarly taxed. They had ridden hard and fast. She also noticed the saddlebags on Fang's horse were not the full, heavy bags of a man on a long journey, but were slim, almost empty. He was traveling light. Too light. "You did not go to Argenta," Mai said, her voice clear and surprisingly strong. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. Fang was taken aback by her audacity. "What nonsense is this?" "The marshal is in Argenta," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "It is a long ride. Your horse is tired, but not tired enough for a ride to Argenta and back. You have not been to see the law. You came from the east. From the railroad camp." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the faces of Fang's hired men. They had been told this was a legal matter, sanctioned by the law. Benjamin saw the opening Mai had created. "He's bluffing," he said to his brothers, his voice low but firm. If he had the law on his side, he'd have brought the marshal, not a pair of hired guns. The truth of it settled over them. Fang's power was built on the illusion of authority, on legal documents and the threat of a law he had no intention of involving. He was a merchant, a man of the city. He likely feared and distrusted territorial lawmen as much as anyone. He had come to settle this with brute force because it was the only power he truly had. "She's a lying girl who knows nothing," Fang snarled, his composure unraveling. He lunged for her. But he never reached her. Levi, moving with surprising speed for a man his size, intercepted him, grabbing him by the front of his coat and lifting him effortlessly off the ground. The two hired men started to move, but they were met by the wall of the other 6 brothers. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1, facing men who were not armed, but whose hardened bodies and fierce, protective glares promised a fight they could not win. They hesitated, looking from the brothers to their employer, who was dangling helplessly in Levi's grip. Their loyalty was to their pay, not to him. This was not the easy job they had been promised. "Get off our land," Caleb commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that came not from a document, but from the conviction of a man defending his home. The hired men looked at each other, then slowly began to back away toward their horses. Levi gave Fang a shake and then dropped him in the dust. Humiliated and furious, Fang scrambled to his feet. He glared at Mai, his face a mask of hatred. He had been outmaneuvered, his bluff called by the very woman he had considered a mindless possession. Without a word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, his hired men following at a distance. They did not look back. The sun set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and red. The 7 brothers and the woman they had chosen to protect stood together in the yard, watching until the riders were nothing more than specks on the horizon. The immediate danger had passed. They had faced down the storm and held their ground. They had won. 3 months later, the first chill of autumn was in the air. The leaves on the cottonwood trees along the creek were turning a brilliant gold, and the fields had been harvested, the fruits of a long summer's labor stored safely in the barn. The Miller farm was a picture of prosperity and order. The fences were mended, the barn had a new coat of whitewash, and the farmhouse itself felt different. It felt settled. Inside, the kitchen was the warm heart of the home. Shelves that had once been haphazard were now neatly lined with jars of preserved vegetables from Mai's garden, a sprawling, productive plot she had coaxed from the dry soil. The room was filled with the scent of baking bread. Mai had brought more than cleanliness to their lives, she had brought a sense of permanence, of a future being built one small, careful act at a time. She had her own room now. In the weeks following the confrontation with Fang, the brothers had worked together to build an addition onto the house. It was a simple, sturdy room with a window that faced the sunrise. It wasn't just a space to sleep, it was a statement, built of timber and nails and respect. It was her room, in her home. One evening, as she sat by her new window reading a book Benjamin had bought for her in town, he knocked softly on her open door. He held 2 steaming mugs. "Caleb said a frost is coming tonight," he said, handing one to her. It was tea, fragrant with mint from her garden. "Thank you," she said, her smile genuine and easy. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade. The awkwardness that had once defined their interactions had long since melted away, replaced by a deep, unspoken understanding. "Sterling was in town today," Benjamin said. "Heard Fang sold his interests in Argenta and went back to California. Seems he doesn't have a taste for Nevada anymore." Mai nodded, a sense of finality settling over her. That chapter of her life was truly closed. "This is a good place," she said softly, looking out at the land that had become her own. "You have made it a good place." "We all did," he corrected her gently. He was right. It wasn't just their labor or her care. It was the fusion of the two. They had given her a home when she was lost, and she, in turn, had shown them how to live in it. She had arrived asking for nothing more than a corner to sleep in, a place to hide from the world. But in the end, they had all found something more. It wasn't about a contract or a debt. It was about the simple, human truth that a family isn't always the one you are born into. Sometimes, it's the one you build together, with courage, kindness, and a place to call your own. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.